Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I used to be a skeptic. Ghost stories, paranormal encounters, and tales of the supernatural. I always brushed them off as nothing more than a product of an overactive imagination. That was until the night I woke up and saw the figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was late October, the air outside crisp and cool. My apartment building was old, one of those pre-war brick structures with creaky floorboards and walls that whispered as they settled. I had moved in a few months earlier, lured by the charm of the high ceilings and hardwood floors. Rent was cheap, and the landlord mentioned the occasional draft, but I didn't care. I liked the idea of living in a place with history. Now I regret that decision more than anything. It started small. A misplaced object here and there. My keys never seemed to be where I left them, and occasionally, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway, even though I knew no one else was around. At first, I chalked it up to exhaustion from long work days and the natural quirks of an old building. But then, the nightmares began. Every night for a week, I dreamt of the same thing. A tall, shadowy figure loomed over me, its face obscured by darkness. I could never move, paralyzed by fear as it stood at the foot of my bed, watching me. Its presence was suffocating, an overwhelming sense of dread that made my skin crawl. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced the figure was still there. But every time I blinked away the grogginess, I saw nothing but the empty room. Sleep became a battle. I dreaded going to bed, knowing that as soon as I closed my eyes, the figure would return. One night, after a particularly bad dream, I decided to leave the lamp on, hoping the soft glow would chase away whatever haunted me. It didn't help. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke with a start. My chest was tight, breath shallow, as though something heavy had been pressing down on me. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the streetlights outside filtering through the blinds. For a moment I thought I had finally beaten the nightmare, but then I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed, bathed in the dim glow of the lamp, was the figure. Only this time it wasn't part of a dream. I froze, my pulse roaring in my ears. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, an imposing silhouette against the pale yellow light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, gangly limbs that stretched impossibly thin. Its head was slightly cocked to the side, as though observing me with morbid curiosity. I wanted to scream, to leap out of bed and run, but I couldn't. My body felt like it was made of lead, pinned to the mattress by an unseen force. All I could do was stare at the figure, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The longer I looked, the more details I could make out. Its face, or what should have been a face, was nothing more than a blank void. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just an empty black expanse that seemed to suck the light from the room. I don't know how long I lay there trapped in that waking nightmare. It could have been minutes or hours, but eventually the figure moved. Slowly, it began to glide toward me, its elongated arms swaying unnervingly at its sides. I wanted to cry out, to beg it to stay away, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, my tongue heavy in my mouth. Just as it reached the side of my bed, the figure stopped. It loomed over me, its featureless face mere inches from mine. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, without warning, it vanished. Gone. Like it had never been there at all. I gasped, bolting upright in bed, my body finally free from whatever paralysis had gripped me. My heart was racing, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I reached for the lamp, frantically twisting the switch on and off, as if the sudden brightness would somehow dispel the lingering terror. But no matter how many times I blinked, the image of the figure was burned into my mind. That night was only the beginning. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been another nightmare, just a particularly vivid one. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure was real, and worse, I knew it would be back. I started avoiding my bedroom altogether, opting to sleep on the couch instead. But the figure followed me. Every night without fail, I would wake up to find it standing at the foot of the couch, watching me with that same eerie stillness. I couldn't escape it, no matter where I went. I told a few friends about it, hoping someone might have a rational explanation, but they all just laughed it off. Stress, they said. Maybe I needed a vacation. I wish it were that simple. Days turned into weeks, and the figure became a constant presence in my life. It didn't just appear at night anymore. It started to manifest during the day, too. I'd catch glimpses of it in mirrors, its dark form flickering in the reflection before vanishing when I turned around. Sometimes, I'd hear faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, though I could never make out what they were saying. Sleep deprivation took its toll. I was barely functioning at work, my eyes constantly darting to the shadows, expecting the figure to appear at any moment. I stopped going out with friends, terrified that I'd see it lurking in the corners of whatever bar or restaurant we were in. My life had become a waking nightmare. Then came the night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to confront the figure to understand what it wanted, why it was tormenting me. So, I made a plan. I set up a camera in my bedroom, determined to capture evidence of the figure's existence. If I could just record it, maybe I could prove I wasn't losing my mind. That night, I lay in bed, the camera rolling, waiting for the figure to appear. Sure enough, around 3 a.m., it came. The same towering silhouette, standing at the foot of my bed, just as it had every night before. But this time, I wasn't paralyzed. I forced myself to move, to sit up and face it head on. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky but firm. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and unmoving. And then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You invited me." Chills ran down my spine. What did that mean? I hadn't invited anyone, let alone something like this. My mind raced, trying to piece together what it was talking about. The figure began to move closer, and I scrambled to the side of the bed, grabbing the camera. I pointed it at the figure, praying it would capture something, anything. But when I looked through the lens, the figure was gone. It was as if it had never been there. That's when I realized no one else could see it. It wasn't something that could be recorded or proven. It was mine, and mine alone. I'm writing this now, in the dim light of the lamp, because I know tonight is the night it will finally take me. The figure has been growing bolder, standing closer each time. Last night, it whispered my name, and I could feel its cold breath on my neck. I don't know what's going to happen, but if you're reading this, be careful what you invite into your life. Sometimes, you don't realize what you've welcomed in until it's too late. The figure is standing at the foot of my bed again, and this time, I can't look away. I always thought that moving into my first house would be a fresh start, a new chapter in my life. No more cramped apartment living, no more noisy neighbors waking me up in the middle of the night. Just peace, quiet, and the comfort of knowing I had a place of my own. I couldn't have been more wrong. The house was perfect, or so I thought. Nestled in the quiet outskirts of town, it was a 2-story Victorian with a wraparound porch and big windows that filled the rooms with natural light. It had character, quirks that came with its age, like the creaky hardwood floors and the slightly uneven stairs. The realtor assured me that the house had been well maintained, and I believed her. Besides, it was within my price range, and I was ready to make it mine. For the first few days, everything was as I had hoped. I spent my time unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and getting used to the idea that this was my space. The only odd thing was the occasional sound of the house settling, You know, those strange creaks and groans old houses make when the wind shifts or the temperature changes. It didn't bother me, though. I expected it. What I didn't expect were the footsteps. It started about a week after I moved in. I was upstairs in the bedroom, just about to drift off to sleep, when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway downstairs. At first I brushed it off, assuming it was just the house settling again, but the sound was too distinct, too human. Slow, measured steps, like someone walking barefoot across the wooden floor. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, probably a figment of my imagination, or maybe even an animal outside. But just as I laid back down, I heard them again. This time, they were louder, more pronounced, as though someone or something was walking directly beneath me. I grabbed my phone, flicking on the flashlight, and made my way cautiously down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was no one there. The front door was still locked, the windows shut tight. I checked every room, every closet, but found nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, but I reassured myself that it was just my nerves getting the better of me. The next morning, I shrugged it off as exhaustion. I'd been working long hours at my new job and dealing with the stress of moving. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer. I was in the kitchen finishing up some dishes when I heard them. Clear as day, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway behind me. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the hall was empty. A cold chill ran down my spine. I slowly walked toward the hallway, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. Still, nothing. The footsteps became a nightly occurrence after that, always the same, slow, deliberate, and eerily human. They started in the hallway, but as the nights passed, they seemed to spread throughout the house. I'd hear them upstairs when I was downstairs, or in the living room when I was in the bedroom. Sometimes they would stop for hours, only to start up again in the middle of the night, waking me from a deep sleep. I couldn't explain it. The rational part of my brain wanted to believe it was all in my head, but the footsteps were too real, too consistent. I started to dread the nights. The sound of those phantom steps would fill the house, creeping along the floorboards, always just out of sight. And no matter how many times I checked, no matter how many lights I turned on, I could never catch whatever or whoever was causing them. One night, I decided to set up my phone to record the hallway. If there was something or someone there, I was going to catch it on camera. I set it on a table facing the hall, hit record, and went to bed. The house was quiet that night. I didn't hear any footsteps, and I began to wonder if the whole thing had finally stopped. The next morning, I checked the recording. At first, there was nothing but static silence. I sped through the video, watching the empty hallway and fast forward. But about 2 hours in, the phone's camera shook slightly, as if something had brushed past it. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard it, the footsteps. I leaned in closer, watching the screen as the sound of slow, deliberate steps grew louder, closer. But there was no one there. The hallway remained empty. My blood ran cold. I watched the rest of the video, hoping for an explanation, but all I got was more of the same. Footsteps with no source, no figure, no shadow. Nothing. I deleted the video and shoved my phone into my pocket, my hands trembling. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps grew more frequent, more invasive. They would start as soon as the sun went down, sometimes even before. I would hear them while I was eating dinner, taking a shower, or sitting on the couch. They were constant, like a second heartbeat pulsing through the house. I tried to ignore them, but the sense of dread kept growing. I felt like I was being watched, even though I never saw anyone. Every time I walked through the hallway, I half expected to feel a hand on my shoulder, to turn around and see a figure standing there. But there was never anything, just the oppressive weight of an unseen presence that never left. Desperate for answers, I started researching the house. I needed to know if something had happened here, something that could explain the footsteps. I spent hours combing through old newspapers, property records, and anything I could find about the house's history. That's when I stumbled upon a small article buried in an archive from the late 1960s. A man had died in the house. No, he hadn't just died. He'd been murdered. His name was William Hale, and he had been found dead in the very hallway where I kept hearing the footsteps. The police report was vague, but it mentioned that he had been struck on the head with a blunt object. His wife had been the prime suspect, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict her, so the case remained unsolved. The article sent chills down my spine. I didn't want to believe that something as tragic as a murder could leave behind a lingering presence, but I couldn't deny the eerie connection. Could the footsteps I'd been hearing belong to William Hale? Was his restless spirit still wandering the house, searching for justice? Or was it something darker? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the house sent my heart racing. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, louder than ever. I sat up in bed, gripping the sheets, and listened as they moved up the stairs, growing closer and closer. My breath hitched as the steps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I stared at the door, expecting it to open, expecting to see some shadowy figure enter the room. But it didn't. The footsteps moved again, this time down the hallway. I felt like I was being toyed with, like something was deliberately trying to drive me mad. I couldn't take it anymore. I leaped out of bed and threw open the door. The hallway was empty, of course, but the air felt heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't explain. I grabbed my phone and opened the recording app, determined to document the footsteps again. I hit record and stood in the hallway, waiting, my pulse pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible creak behind me. I whipped around, phone in hand, but there was nothing there. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the faint glow from my bedroom lamp. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, when suddenly, the footsteps resumed, louder, faster. This time, they were running. I bolted down the stairs, panic surging through me. The footsteps followed, thudding against the wooden floor, chasing me down the hall. I could feel something behind me, something I couldn't see, but I didn't dare look back. I flung open the front door and ran outside, gasping for breath as I stumbled onto the lawn. The night was silent. No footsteps, no creaks, nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. I turned back toward the house, half expecting to see something staring back at me through the windows. But the house stood still, dark and quiet, as if nothing happened. I didn't go back inside that night. I stayed in my car, parked on the street, with the doors locked and my phone clutched in my hand. The recording was still running. When I finally worked up the nerve to watch it, I saw nothing but darkness, heard nothing but my own frantic footsteps. The next morning, I called a moving company. I wasn't staying in that house another night. I never found out what or who was causing the footsteps. But I know what I heard. I know I wasn't imagining it. To this day, I can still hear those phantom steps in my mind, echoing through the hallway, following me wherever I go. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house isn't finished with me yet. There's something unsettling about being in an empty school after dark. You could chalk it up to the long corridors, the eerie stillness, or the way the echo of your footsteps lingers longer than it should. But for me, the fear began when I stayed late at Harrison Middle School. I'd heard the stories growing up, just like everyone else in town, about the ghostly janitor and the girl who never made it out of the basement. You know, the usual campfire stuff. Except, I wasn't prepared to find out how real those stories could be. My name is Ben. I'm 32 now, but when I was 12, something happened at Harrison Middle School that I've never been able to shake. To this day, I can't set foot in a school building without a chill running down my spine, as if the ghosts of Harrison still linger, watching and waiting for me to return. It all started with a dare, as these things often do. My friend Jake and I had heard all the urban legends about our school, how it was built on old burial grounds, how the janitor's spirit roamed the halls at night, and how there was a haunted room in the basement that no one ever came back from. For most kids, those stories were fun little mysteries, something to make you glance over your shoulder during lunch breaks. But for Jake, they were an invitation. "Come on, Ben," he'd said one afternoon, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Let's sneak in tonight, see if any of this ghost stuff is real." At first, I'd laughed it off. The thought of wandering around an empty school at night was weird enough, but doing it to look for ghosts? No thanks. But Jake was relentless. He wore me down with his endless taunting, calling me a chicken and daring me to prove him wrong. Eventually, I gave in. I wish I hadn't. It was a Friday night, and we waited until it was well past midnight before sneaking out of our houses. Harrison Middle School sat at the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods and an unsettling quiet. As we approached, the pale moonlight made the building's old, crumbling bricks look more menacing than they did during the day. The front door was locked, of course, but Jake had found an open window in the back, just big enough for us to slip through. As soon as we were inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. The silence wasn't just empty, it felt alive, as though the building itself was listening. We began by walking down the main hallway, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. The lockers, which during the day were bustling with students, now stood like sentinels, looming over us. Every little sound, our footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the occasional distant clank, seemed amplified tenfold. "Let's head to the basement," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. I wasn't sure why he was whispering. There was no one else here, right? But I found myself doing the same. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I asked, my nerves already on edge. Jake just grinned in that reckless way of his and nodded. We made our way down the stairwell that led to the basement, each step creaking louder than the last. The air grew colder as we descended, and the smell of damp concrete and dust hit my nose. I remember my heart pounding in my chest as Jake pushed open the heavy door at the bottom of the stairs. The basement was nothing like the rest of the school. It was dark and labyrinthine, with old equipment scattered about. Broken chairs, outdated textbooks, things that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. The walls were stained, and the ceiling had watermarks from years of leaks. But what stood out most was the oppressive feeling that we weren't alone. We wandered deeper into the basement, and that's when things started getting weird. The first thing I noticed was the sound. At first I thought it was just our echoing footsteps, but then it became clear that there was something else, something faint, like a soft tapping or scraping coming from behind the walls. Jake heard it too. He stopped dead in his tracks, turning his head toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I muttered, my mouth dry. "It's probably just pipes or something." But Jake wasn't convinced, and neither was I. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was on the other side of the wall, waiting for us. We kept moving, but now my skin prickled with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. Silence fell over us, thick and suffocating. Then the lights went out. We were plunged into total darkness, our flashlights flickering before cutting out completely. Panic set in immediately. I fumbled in my backpack for the extra batteries, but my hands were trembling so badly that I dropped them. Jake was trying to stay calm, but I could hear the fear in his voice. "Ben, hurry up," he hissed. As I scrambled to find the batteries on the cold, damp floor, something strange happened. I heard footsteps, not ours. These were heavier, slower, like someone deliberately pacing back and forth in the hallway just outside the room. "Jake?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. Do you hear that?" He didn't respond. I looked up, and in the dim light, I could just make out his face, pale, eyes wide with terror, staring at something behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Standing in the doorway was a figure. It was tall, its features obscured by shadow, but I could see enough to know it wasn't one of us. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, two small, pale orbs that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. And the smell, the air filled with a sharp metallic scent that made my stomach turn. We both froze, too terrified to move. The figure didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there watching us. Then it started to whisper. The sound was low, guttural, like something from a nightmare. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The intent was clear. We weren't supposed to be here. Without a word, Jake grabbed my arm and we bolted. We ran back through the basement, up the stairs, and down the hallways, not stopping until we reached the window we'd crawled through. I don't know how we managed to get out, but we did, hearts pounding, lungs burning as we sprinted all the way back to Jake's house. We never talked about what we saw that night. Not really. I think Jake wanted to forget it as much as I did. But even after all these years, I can't get that figure out of my mind, the way it stood there, waiting, as though it had been expecting us. I wish I could say that was the end of it. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the tapping. And when I pass by the old Harrison Middle School, I swear I see something watching from the basement windows. Something that never left. It all started with a dare. I was 26, working as a freelance photographer, constantly on the lookout for something unusual to capture. Urban decay, abandoned buildings, old cemeteries. The stranger the subject, the better. One night, while hanging out with some friends at a bar, the conversation turned to ghost towns. Those eerie places that had been left behind, as if the people who lived there just vanished overnight. That's when Aaron brought it up. "You ever hear about Ambrose?" he asked, lowering his voice as though it were a secret. "Ambrose?" I repeated, trying to place the name. I'd lived in the state for years, but it wasn't ringing any bells. "Yeah," he said, leaning in. "It's not on any maps, but people say if you drive through the right part of the countryside at night, you'll find it. An old mining town. Thing is, it's only there between sunset and sunrise. During the day, it's just empty fields. No one knows why, but it's been like that for decades, and some say if you stay too long, you disappear, just like the town." "Come on, man," I said, smirking, though my curiosity was already piqued. "You expect us to believe that?" Aaron shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I know someone who went out there once. Said he saw the town with his own eyes. Even took pictures, but when he tried to show them to me, they were all blank. And the weirdest part? He swore the place looked like it hadn't aged a day since the 1800s. That was all it took. I had to see this place for myself." A few days later, I was in my car, driving out to the middle of nowhere with only the vaguest directions Aaron had given me. It was late in the afternoon when I finally found the stretch of road he'd mentioned. Miles of barren farmland stretched on either side, the kind of place where you didn't see another soul for hours. I checked my watch. Sunset was just half an hour away. If there was any truth to the legend, Ambrose would soon reveal itself. I pulled over and waited. The sky gradually shifted from bright blue to a deep purple, the sun sinking behind the horizon. Darkness crept in quickly, and as the last rays of light disappeared, I noticed something strange on the horizon. At first, it was just a faint outline, like a mirage, shimmering in the dusk. But then, as the minutes ticked by, the outline solidified into something much more tangible. A collection of buildings, streets, and lights that hadn't been there a moment ago. My heart pounded in my chest. Ambrose, the disappearing town. I grabbed my camera and climbed out of the car, moving toward the town, which seemed to pulse with an eerie life of its own. The closer I got, the more I realized how unsettlingly pristine it looked. The buildings were old-fashioned, Victorian storefronts, saloons, a courthouse, all bathed in the glow of gas lamps. The streets were cobblestone, the kind you'd expect in a western frontier town, not here in the middle of nowhere. But something felt off. There was no wind, no sound except for the crunch of my boots on the cobblestones. No voices, no distant cars, no animals. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed by silence. I wandered deeper into Ambrose, my camera clicking as I took photos of everything: buildings, street signs, even the shadows that seemed unnaturally long and dark. I looked at the display screen after each shot, satisfied that I was capturing this bizarre, forgotten place. But the longer I stayed, the more uneasy I felt. It was hard to explain, but there was a sense that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see someone there, but the streets remained deserted. After an hour or so, I found myself standing in front of what looked like an old inn. Its wooden sign swung gently in a breeze I couldn't feel, and the door creaked open as if inviting me in. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The interior was just as frozen in time as the rest of the town. Dusty tables, a long wooden bar, and a staircase that led to the upper floors. I snapped a few pictures, then paused, listening. There it was again, that feeling of being watched. But this time, it felt closer, more intense. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty inn. No answer. I took a few more steps forward, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A man, or at least something that resembled a man. He was tall, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a black coat, worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. "Hey!" I shouted, raising my camera instinctively. "Who are you?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. I snapped a picture, but when I looked at the camera's display, the photo was completely black. Confused, I lowered the camera and looked back at the figure. Only it was gone. Vanished, like a puff of smoke. That's when I knew I needed to leave. I turned and bolted out of the inn, heart hammering in my chest. The streets outside were just as silent as before, but now they felt more oppressive, as though the entire town had shifted its attention to me. Every building, every shadow seemed to loom closer, watching, waiting. I ran back toward where I'd parked my car, but something was wrong. The layout of the town had changed. The streets twisted and turned in ways they hadn't before, leading me in circles. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't find my way out. My breath came in ragged gasps as I frantically searched for any familiar landmark, but nothing made sense anymore. It was like the town was alive, deliberately confusing me, trapping me. I glanced at my watch. It was close to midnight. Just a few more hours until sunrise. If the town really did disappear during the day, maybe I could outlast it. I ducked into an alley, pressing my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing off the cobblestones. They were coming closer. I peeked around the corner and saw the figure again, the man in the hat. But this time there were others, dozens of figures, all dressed in the same antiquated clothing, slowly emerging from the shadows. Their faces were pale, hollow, like corpses that had been preserved too long. I backed away, terror gripping me, but there was no escape. The figures closed in from every direction, their footsteps slow and methodical, like they had all the time in the world. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice was trembling. They didn't listen. One of them reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against my arm, and I felt a cold so intense it burned. I yanked my arm away, stumbling backward. My camera slipped from my hands, hitting the ground with a thud. The figures paused, their empty eyes fixed on me as if waiting for something. Desperately, I fumbled with the camera, trying to pull up the photos I'd taken. But when I looked, every single one was blank, just like Aaron's friend had said. The figures moved closer, their faces twisted in expressions I couldn't read. I backed away until I was pressed against a building, nowhere left to run. The cold, skeletal hands reached for me and I felt my body go numb. Then, just as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, everything stopped. The figures vanished. The town around me faded, dissolving like a mirage, until I was standing alone in the middle of an empty field. The only sign that Ambrose had ever existed was the pounding in my chest and the cold, burning sensation on my arm where the figure had touched me. I ran back to my car and drove away without looking back, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed place. When I finally pulled over to catch my breath, I checked my camera again, hoping against hope that something would be there. But just like before, every photo was black. Ambrose was gone. But the memory of that night, of those figures, has never left me. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel that cold hand on my arm, as though it's waiting for me to return. Because I know deep down that Ambrose is still out there, waiting for nightfall. And if I'm not careful, one day, it might come for me again. You never forget the feeling of cold tile under your feet in an abandoned hospital. There's something about the air. It's stagnant and still, like it's never known life. I can't explain what made me go that night. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't the urge for adventure or to prove something to myself. No, it was a dare. And like all bad ideas, it started with a group of friends and too much time on our hands. My name is Evan, and I was 21 when it happened. I've told this story only once before, but most people don't believe it. They think it's just another urban legend about St. Mary's Hospital, the old asylum on the outskirts of town. But I lived it, every moment, and it's been burned into my memory ever since. St. Mary's had been shut down for decades. They closed it in the early 90s after a series of strange incidents, mysterious patient disappearances, doctors resigning out of nowhere, rumors of inhumane treatments. Some even whispered that a patient uprising happened and that many never left the building alive. For years, it had been a local landmark of fear and fascination. Everyone knew someone who'd snuck in there, but no one had spent the night. Until us. My friend group wasn't particularly adventurous. We were typical college students, spending most of our nights playing video games or hanging out at the local bar. But things took a turn one weekend when we were bored out of our minds. Josh, always the instigator, threw out the idea like a joke. Why don't we stay overnight at St. Mary's? I mean, no one's done it. We'd be legends. There was a beat of silence, followed by laughter. Except, after a while, that laughter turned into serious contemplation. Maybe it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the sheer boredom. But soon the idea became real. A challenge. Stay overnight in the creepiest place we could think of, the old abandoned asylum. Before I knew it, the date was set. Saturday night. Just me, Josh, Sarah, and Kevin. We arrived around midnight. The drive out to the hospital was eerie enough. The road was long, winding, and desolate, flanked by dense woods that seemed to swallow up the moonlight. St. Mary's loomed ahead like a fortress, its silhouette cutting an ominous figure against the night sky. The building was massive, 4 stories high, with rows of broken windows that gave it a hollow, skeletal look. We parked the car a good distance away, just in case someone spotted us trespassing, and made our way to the entrance. The front doors were chained shut, but Josh had done his homework. There was a side window, smashed long ago, that we could climb through. One by one, we slipped inside, landing in what used to be the hospital's lobby. Immediately, the temperature dropped. It was like stepping into a different world. The air was cold and damp, thick with the scent of mold and rot. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and debris littered the floor. Old gurneys and rusted medical equipment were scattered about, abandoned and forgotten. It was dead silent, save for the occasional drip of water from somewhere in the distance. We flicked on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the darkness like knives. The long hallways stretched out before us, disappearing into shadow. Creepy as hell, Kevin muttered, nervously chuckling. Exactly what we signed up for, Josh said with a grin, trying to hide his own discomfort. We'd agreed on the rules beforehand. We had to make it to the 4th floor and stay there until sunrise. Easy, right? Just a few hours in a haunted building. What could possibly go wrong? As we began walking through the hospital, the unease set in almost immediately. Every creak of the floor, every distant rustle, felt like eyes on the back of our necks. We passed by old patient rooms, the doors hanging crookedly on their hinges. Some still had beds inside, long decayed. The graffiti on the walls was a mix of crude drawings and cryptic messages. "They're watching. Never leave." And one that simply said, "Run." It was hard to tell if the messages were left by vandals or by someone who had experienced something far worse. Either way, they didn't help my nerves. Halfway through the 2nd floor, we heard it. A faint sound. It was distant, almost too faint to register, but unmistakably the sound of footsteps, not ours. These were heavier, deliberate. We all stopped dead in our tracks, the blood draining from our faces. Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We nodded in silence, our hearts pounding in sync. Josh, ever the brave one, waved us forward. "It's probably just the wind," he said, though his voice cracked slightly. But we knew better. It wasn't the wind. The footsteps continued, this time closer. We aimed our flashlights down the hallway, expecting to see someone emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the same decaying walls and empty rooms. "We need to keep moving," Josh urged, though now even he wasn't sounding so sure. We made it to the stairs, and as we ascended, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost suffocating. By the time we reached the 4th floor, it felt like the walls were closing in on us. This floor was different. The air was colder, the smell worse. The walls were stained with dark patches that looked suspiciously like old blood. And then there were the doors, dozens of them, lining both sides of the hall, each one leading to what had once been a patient's room. "These were the isolation wards," Kevin said quietly, "where they kept the dangerous ones." We found an old nurse's station and decided to set up camp there. We spread out our sleeping bags, though none of us were in any rush to lie down. The silence was oppressive now. None of us spoke, but we all felt it. The presence. Like we weren't alone. Like something was watching us. That's when the door slammed. It was so sudden and loud that Sarah screamed, and Kevin dropped his flashlight. The noise echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. We spun around, flashing our lights in every direction. But there was no one. The hallway was empty. The doors remained closed, except one. At the far end of the hall, a door was now open. A door that had been shut just moments before. It swung slightly on its hinges, as if someone had just walked through it. "Josh," I said, my voice barely a whisper. But Josh was already moving. Before we could stop him, he was walking down the hall toward the open door. Sarah and I exchanged a glance, both of us frozen in place. Kevin looked like he wanted to bolt. Josh reached the door and peeked inside. We held our breath. There's something here," he called out, his voice tight. Reluctantly, we followed him. The room was small and empty, save for an old metal bed frame and a broken window. At first, it seemed like nothing was out of the ordinary. Just another decaying room in a forgotten building. But then I noticed the writing on the wall. It was scrawled in thick, dark letters, barely visible in the dim light. "Get out while you still can." "Okay, I'm done," Kevin said, backing away. But before we could move, the door slammed shut behind us. The sound was deafening, like someone had kicked it with all their strength. Sarah screamed again, and this time, I didn't blame her. We all rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. Josh yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't move. Come on, he shouted. Then we heard it, The footsteps again, louder this time, coming from just outside the door. Heavy, deliberate, moving slowly down the hallway toward us. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and then a voice. Low, raspy, almost inhuman. They never leave. The words chilled me to the bone. We were trapped, helpless, with someone on the other side of that door. Something that didn't want us to leave. Suddenly, the door burst open with a force that sent us stumbling backward, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. Without thinking, we grabbed our things and bolted. We ran down the stairs, through the dark corridors, not stopping until we were back outside, gasping for breath. We never spoke of it again. We never returned to St. Mary's, but I still hear those footsteps sometimes in my dreams, always coming closer. And I'll never forget the voice that told us the truth. They never leave, and neither will I. The first time I heard the knocking, I thought it was the wind. It was late October, and the air outside was thick with the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and lingers there. I'd just moved into an old farmhouse a few miles outside of town, the kind of place that people tell stories about, but no one really knows the truth. It had been abandoned for years, left to rot and decay. But it was cheap, and at the time, I needed something cheap. I wasn't prepared for what came with it. The farmhouse was surrounded by endless fields, the kind that swallowed the horizon and left you feeling like you were the only person left in the world. At night, the isolation was suffocating. The darkness felt different here, thicker somehow. The only sound was the occasional creak of the house settling and the wind rattling the windows. That night, I sat in my worn-out recliner, trying to lose myself in an old book when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps at the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and no one ever came out this far after dark. For a moment, I thought it must have been my imagination, a trick played by the wind and the creaky old wood of the house. But then, it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Louder this time, more insistent. I stood up, my body rigid with unease. Maybe it was just someone lost, I thought. Maybe a traveler or some kid playing a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. I could feel it, an unsettling chill crawling up my spine. Something wasn't right. I walked to the door slowly, every step heavy with dread. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and my fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for just a second, but then I pulled the door open. There was no one there. The porch was empty, just a vast expanse of darkness beyond the old, sagging steps. I stood there for a moment, staring out into the night, my breath fogging in the icy air. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, only silence. Shutting the door, I told myself it was the wind. It had to be. I tried to go back to reading, to push the strange knocking out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my gut. That night, I barely slept. The knocking came again the next night. This time it was around midnight, and the sound was unmistakable. 3 hard, deliberate knocks. My pulse quickened, but I was determined not to let fear get the best of me. I stormed to the door, yanked it open without hesitation, and again, nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone, just the same thick, oppressive darkness. I closed the door, locked it, and sat back down. But the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than before. I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder at the window, half expecting to see someone or something staring back at me. That's when I noticed something strange. The old clock on the mantel had stopped. It had been working fine since I moved in, ticking away the quiet hours. But now, the hands were frozen at exactly midnight. I stared at it for a while, my mind racing to find a rational explanation. But before I could dwell on it any longer, I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. It came from the back of the house, from the door leading to the old cellar. The cellar was the one place in the house I hadn't ventured into yet. Something about it felt wrong. The previous owner had mentioned that it was where they stored old family relics, things no one wanted but couldn't bring themselves to throw away. I'd figured I'd leave it alone. But now, the sound was coming from down there. 3 distinct knocks, just like before. My body felt cold all over, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the kitchen counter and slowly made my way toward the back door. Each step felt heavier than the last, like something was pulling me back, warning me not to go any further. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I could feel something waiting on the other side, something unnatural. The air around me seemed to thicken, like the very house was holding its breath. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. Then, before I could open it, the knocking stopped. Everything was silent, deadly silent. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen, but there was nothing. The air was still, and all I could hear was the distant hum of the wind outside. I turned the handle, pushed the door open, and shined my flashlight down the cellar stairs. The light barely cut through the darkness, illuminating only the first few steps. The cellar was colder than the rest of the house, and the air smelled damp, like rotting wood and earth. I started to descend, my heart pounding in my chest, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. There, in the far corner of the cellar, stood an old, weathered coffin. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my blood run cold. The coffin looked ancient, its wood dark and splintered with age. A thick layer of dust covered the top, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. But the lid was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the darkness inside. I took a step closer, my mind racing with questions. What the hell was this doing here? Why had I never noticed it before? As I approached, the knocking came again, this time from inside the coffin. Knock, knock, knock. I stumbled back, the sound reverberating through the cellar, louder and more insistent. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought it would die, plunging me into complete darkness. But it stayed on, just barely, casting a faint light over the coffin. The knocking continued, growing more frantic. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot. It was like the house itself wouldn't let me leave. My heart raced and my breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the coffin. Suddenly the knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. A silence so thick it pressed against my ears. Then, slowly, the lid of the coffin began to creak open. I froze, my mind screaming at me to move, to run. But I couldn't. I could only watch in horror as the lid slid off completely, revealing the figure inside. It was a man, or what used to be a man. His skin was gray and shriveled, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and his hands were clenched into fists, as though he had died trying to fight his way out. And then, he moved. His head turned slowly, his empty eyes locking onto mine. I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the ground as I scrambled up the stairs. Behind me, I heard the scraping of wood against stone as the corpse dragged itself out of the coffin, its slow, methodical movements echoing in the darkness. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it. Something was still down there, waiting. And then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was at the door right behind me. I never opened that door again. It started as a whisper. At first, I thought it was the house settling, wooden beams creaking, pipes groaning from the sudden chill of winter setting in. I'd bought this house a few months ago. an old Victorian relic that had stood on the outskirts of town for over a century. I was drawn to its charm, its towering spires, intricate woodwork, and that eerie kind of beauty that only age can give to a building. I'm Nathan, 32 years old and recently single. After a messy breakup and a decision to make a fresh start, this place felt like the escape I needed. It was far from the noise of the city, nestled in a secluded patch of woods, where my only neighbors were the trees and occasional wildlife. I thought the silence would be calming, but it wasn't silence, it was something far worse. I first noticed the sound about a week after moving in. It was late, around midnight, and I just settled into bed after a long day of unpacking. I was drifting between wakefulness and sleep when I heard it. A faint rustling, like something was moving inside the walls. At first I dismissed it. Old houses make strange noises, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or a squirrel had gotten inside. It wasn't worth worrying about. But it didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the noises became more frequent. What began as a soft rustle turned into persistent scratching, slow, deliberate, as though something was scraping its way through the walls. Sometimes it would stop for hours, leaving me in an anxious silence, only to return even louder, almost as if whatever was inside the walls was growing bolder, more eager to make its presence known. I tried rationalizing it. It had to be animals. I called pest control, convinced they'd find a nest or some burrowing critters hiding in the crawl spaces. The guy showed up, did a thorough inspection of the attic and the walls, but after a couple of hours he came down shaking his head. "Nothing," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "No droppings, no tracks, no signs of any kind of infestation. The place is clean. Whatever you're hearing, it's not an animal." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "But I hear something every night." "Are you sure?" "Positive," he replied. "Old houses like this. They make noise. Could be temperature changes making the wood expand and contract, that sort of thing." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. It didn't sound like creaking wood. The sound was too deliberate, too intelligent. The following nights were worse. The scratching grew more frequent, more insistent, almost as if something or someone was trying to claw their way out. At first, it stayed near the far wall of my bedroom, but soon it spread. I could hear it in the living room, in the hallway, in the kitchen, and then the whispering began. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible beneath the scratching. A low murmur that I could only hear if the house was perfectly silent. It was like the sound of a conversation happening just out of earshot, voices muffled behind thick walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister, like someone or something was discussing me in hushed, conspiratorial tones. Sleep became impossible. Every night the noises intensified. My mind was constantly on edge, teetering between terror and exhaustion. I thought I was losing it. I even recorded the sounds one night on my phone, but when I played them back, the audio was nothing but static. I tried inviting friends over for dinner, hoping they'd hear it too. But whenever anyone else was around, the house was dead silent. No scratching, no whispers. Just me, alone with my thoughts, wondering if I was going insane. One night, after nearly 2 weeks of this torment, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was desperate for answers, desperate to prove I wasn't imagining things. So, armed with a flashlight and a hammer, I decided to find out what was inside the walls. I waited until the scratching started again. It was faint but persistent, coming from a section of the wall near the baseboard in my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down, pressing my ear to the wall. The sound was louder now, like nails dragging against plaster, moving just beneath the surface. With trembling hands, I took the hammer and pried away a section of the baseboard. Dust and debris spilled onto the floor, and for a moment, everything went silent. I hesitated, shining the flashlight into the small gap I'd created. The beam illuminated nothing but darkness. No animals, no nests, nothing. Then the scratching returned, right next to my ear. I jumped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The noise was inside the wall, directly in front of me, like something was trapped just behind the plaster. Without thinking, I swung the hammer again, cracking open the wall. Plaster crumbled away, revealing wooden beams and insulation. I tore at it with my hands, desperate to uncover the source. That's when I saw it. At first it looked like a small hole, no larger than a fist, hidden between the wooden beams. But as I shined the flashlight closer, I realized it wasn't a hole. It was an opening, a space that shouldn't have been there. It was dark and deep, and the air that seeped from it was cold, unnaturally cold. And then I saw movement, a shadow, just on the edge of the light, darting back into the darkness. My blood ran cold. Something was living inside the walls, something that wasn't human. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was in there knew I had found it. The whispers returned, clearer now, but still indecipherable. They sounded angry. I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me, and locked myself in the bathroom. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone as I dialed the police. I tried to explain what was happening, but I knew I sounded like a lunatic. They told me they'd send someone to check on me, but I knew it would be too late. The scratching had spread. I could hear it all around me now, behind the walls, above the ceiling, beneath the floor. The entire house was alive with the sound of it, and the whispers. They were louder, clearer. I could almost make out the words now, like a chant, something dark and ancient. I didn't sleep that night. The police arrived the next morning. They didn't find anything, of course. They took one look at the hole I'd made in the wall and told me it was just my imagination, that stress and lack of sleep were playing tricks on my mind. They suggested I see a doctor, maybe get some medication to help me sleep. I didn't argue. I just nodded, letting them think I was crazy. But I knew the truth. That night, I stayed in the living room, keeping every light in the house on. I didn't dare go back into the bedroom, didn't dare get close to the hole in the wall. But even with the lights on, even in the safety of the living room, I could still hear it. The scratching, the whispers, and then the knocking. It was faint at first, a soft tapping coming from the walls, but then it grew louder, more insistent. Knock, 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 like something was demanding to be let out. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. The knocking was moving, traveling through the walls, coming closer and closer. I could hear it moving down the hallway, past the kitchen, toward the living room. Knock, knock, knock. It stopped right behind me. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat. The wall behind me was shaking, the plaster cracking as something pressed against it from the other side. The knocking turned into pounding, the whispers turning into a low, guttural growl. And then the wall burst open. A dark figure, tall and emaciated, crawled out from the hole it had made. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, its eyes sunken and hollow. It moved in jerky, unnatural movements, like it hadn't used its limbs in centuries. And as it dragged itself toward me, its mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, broken teeth. I screamed, stumbling backward, my body frozen with terror. The entity stopped inches from me, its cold, dead eyes locking onto mine. For a moment it just stared at me, and then it whispered, in a voice that wasn't human. "You let me out." I don't remember how I got out of the house. All I know is that I ran, as fast and as far as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed in a gas station parking lot, gasping for breath. I never went back to the house. I sold it to the first buyer I could find, and I didn't care about the loss. I just needed to get away, but the thing is, no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I can still hear the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. It's always there, waiting.